back in 1999, England were knocked out before the official song was released. And 4 years later, England's campaign was blighted by the debate about whether to play games in Zimbabwe. Well, that 2003 World Cup is the subject of a special feature by our senior cricket writer Stefan Schemmelt on the BBC Sport website and the app. The England captain in that tournament was Nasser Hussain. 20 years on, Hussain has been sharing memories with Stefan.
Nasser, when you wrote about your experience in Zimbabwe a year later in your autobiography, you referred to it as the most traumatic time of your life. 20 years on, does it still feel like the most traumatic time of your life?
No, probably not, because that was obviously a culmination of various things at that period of my life, really, because we'd just had an Ashes series that went away from home, that went like most Ashes series of my generation away from home. It was a complete schmozzle. Then we had the Zimbabwe, then we had the World Cup, then we had me retiring, etc. So at that stage, there was a lot going on for me, but it was a difficult time. Definitely, it was my one chance of being captain of an England World Cup squad, which is a huge honour and prestige. And it was quite a good side as well. I remember that was the disappointing thing when we were sitting around debating this, and I've spoken to Nick Knight about it since, and Nick felt that was a pretty good side, as we showed on that in that World Cup at times, that could play a lot of good cricket. And we missed out on an opportunity. There were a couple of things that happened in that World Cup that I look back on. Obviously the Zimbabwe stuff, and then that game in Port Elizabeth with Bickle and Bevan that I look back on, and on a treadmill or going on a long walk on loneliness, and think, could we have handled it differently? Could we have done things differently? It was a very, very difficult situation, let's put it like that. It's not traumatic anymore, but I remember it being a very difficult situation.
Looking back now, can you believe that it was even allowed to develop that situation? And for anyone who can't remember it, it seems absolutely remarkable that a fixture in a Cricket World Cup, which is, I don't know, top 5, top 10 sporting events in the world, not just that fixture, but also New Zealand's game in Kenya, didn't take place. It's absolutely remarkable.
Yeah, it is, and it's almost players deciding it's not going to take place, which is probably unprecedented, really. Just we decided that we weren't going to go, and that was the difficult thing. And it wasn't something that it came sneaked in under the radar. It was a gradual thing. It was something I had thought about with what was going on in Zimbabwe and the political situation, and having spoken to a few of the Zimbabwe team, etc., having Duncan as our coach. I remember in the Ashes speaking to Michael Atherton just on the outfield in one of the games, MCG or somewhere, and it was a quiet period of it, and I just, he just said, be careful, that's going to come on your radar pretty soon. I'd watched a Channel 4 documentary on it. I'd seen what was going on in that country, and I knew this was now going to become an issue for us, not for any other nation. I remember at the hotel when we'd been in the room for 3 days discussing it, and we went out for breakfast one morning, and Matthias Muralitharan from Sri Lanka sort of grabbed me and said, what's the discussion, going to Zimbabwe or not? And I sort of looked at him as if to say, it's not really an issue for Sri Lanka, but it's a definite issue because of the political situation for England. So it was different for us. So we had to discuss it, and the more we discussed it, the more we went round in circles. And then obviously you'd throw in that and the threat that emerged, rightly or wrongly, the sons and daughters letter to the team, and the threat that emerged to the team, that did spook quite a few of the team. But that, for me, it was more about doing the right thing than hiding behind security or fudging it. For me, I wanted to try and do a right thing. I didn't want to be looked back on in 20 years' time as Nasser Hussain was that bloke who was given the option of not going to Zimbabwe, and he'd rather go and try and take the points. Remember, Zimbabwe were a serious side back then. Try and get some points and just make it about cricket. Sometimes politics and sport do clash, and that was one of those occasions.
I want to talk about the sons and daughters of Zimbabwe, but that wasn't revealed to you until quite late in the piece. For a while, for you guys, it was a question of morality, which, when I think you've written in the past that when you tried to raise that with administrators, that wasn't really washing with them, even if it was something that the players were considering. And you've just said it was about, to you guys, doing the right thing.
Yeah, it was. It wasn't to everyone in the team. Like I say, some players believe that sport and politics shouldn't mix. You've got to be very careful who, even in the modern world now, and it's emerged again recently with Saudi Arabia or whatever, and, Qatar and everything. You've got to be really careful when you start picking and choosing when to stand up and when not to stand up, and when to show some moral backbone and when not to, and we will go there but we won't go there, etc. So you have to be careful. And the other thing was, you were asking some very young, Jimmy Anderson had just burst on the scene from Burnley, Lancs seconds to Lancs first to England within the space of 6 months, and he's now sitting in a hotel room in Cape Town, and you're asking him about the political situation and the morality of going to Zimbabwe. Well, here's a lad who just wants to play cricket. And then at the other end, you have people like Nick Knight and a few others that view this as their chance to do something. Nick always described it as after the Lord Mayor's show, white ball cricket. This was what he did. This was his career, a World Cup and white ball cricket, and this was his chance. So as a captain, you also had to bear that in mind. It's all well and good, Nass, you trying to take some kind of moral standpoint, but others just want to go and play cricket. That's their job. So you're almost trying to intertwine all this stuff into making a decision. And that's what probably in the end made it so confusing, was that we almost try to please too many people or think of too many people.
What was it like, locked in that Cullinan hotel for however many days you were, trying to make the decision, meeting after meeting?
Yeah, weird, going round in circles. No help from our board particularly. No help from the ICC at all. It was just simple. You can go there on safety grounds, or we're not going to. You can't just not go because you feel you shouldn't be playing cricket in Zimbabwe. That's not an issue. Then there are other things. I think, like even Nelson Mandela, there was an offer of him to come to speak to the team, speak to me, to explain the situation, and I admire and I appreciated that, because who were we to know what was going on out there, But that got to a state of disbelief. Here I was, a boy from Ilford or whatever, trying to hold a conversation, have a chat with Nelson Mandela about South Africa and Zimbabwe and the World Cup, and then it got even more confused when Andy Flower, who I knew well, and Henry Alonga, we had a meeting with them. Literally, I don't know how we found out. I think Andy might have just told me, and I said, look, can we come and meet you and Henry Alonga? Me and Dunk went and sat in literally, in the hotels you have like one of those business rooms, just a table and 4 chairs, nothing else, massive business room, and it was like just nothing there, and we sat there and we listened, me and Dunk, to Henry Alonga and Andy Flower discussing what they were going to do, because they realised what we were going through. They were very appreciative of what we were going through and sort of admired that we were looking to take a stand, but they told us what they were doing, the black armbands. And I remember walking out, and Duncan, obviously from Zimbabwe, Duncan went, there are 2 very brave men there. And I got the feeling that may be what Duncan wanted us to do. Maybe. I've never spoken to Duncan about this since, actually, so you'd have to get his opinion on that. I didn't think that was right, to go into someone else's country as an Englishman, an England captain, and wear a black armband and protest about them in their country. I just didn't feel that was the right thing for us to do, but it was definitely an incredible thing for the Zimbabwe team and Flower and Alonga to do.
This might be a really daft question, but in the build-up to a World Cup, were you actually spending any time in the nets, or was it only talking about whether you were going to play in Zimbabwe or not?
That's a good question. It was a long time ago. We would have been, definitely. We were focusing in on our cricket, but usually in World Cups, you do your nets, you practice matches, then you'll go back and you'll be around by the pool, and the video games will come out, and corridor cricket in those days, or you'll go out and about. Cape Town's a great city to be in, you know that. But actually what we did, we'd go to the nets, and then we'll go back and we'll say, right, tonight, 6 o'clock, in that room again, and we're going to discuss it, because there were little periods where the first thing was the moral issue, then the sons and daughters, then the ICC, then losing points, then we have to make a decision on this. I was having meetings with Tim Lamb, I was having meetings with Malcolm Speed, we weren't getting anything from them. And it was a very emotional time in the end as well. There were some drained cricketers in there. There was a bit of tears at times when people's family were being threatened. I think Duncan felt maybe that the Sons and Daughters of Zimbabwe letter was not something just to go all in on that. It was like, if you're going to make a decision, make it from your heart. Don't just like cop out because there was a letter that emerged from somewhere. What's the validity of this letter? That just confused matters a bit more. Actually, what it did for some of the players who were keen to go, when that letter arrived, I think some of the players that were keen to go actually said, no, hold on, this is now a turning point. So it was an important moment, because it went from maybe 70 wanting to go, 70%, 30% not wanting to go, to that after that letter it became much more 50-50 and even more the other way.
You only found out about that letter quite late on, but the ECB had known about it for a while. Were you angry that you didn't find out about it until quite late in the piece?
No. I guess what it did for me, it sort of helped me, but I'll be perfectly honest, if it was just me, I wouldn't have gone and played cricket in Zimbabwe at that period. I didn't feel it was the right thing to do. So if it was just me making a decision, so say I was on the other side, I was sat in the rows of seats as a player and Michael Vaughan was captain or something, and he said, Nas, do you want to go? I said, no, sorry. Cricket is important, but from what I'm seeing, what's happening in that country, having spoken to Henry Alonga and Andy Flower, and not for security, just on, I didn't want to be the England captain. I didn't know what was going to happen in Zimbabwe after that. At that period, what could have happened in that country, and there were we sort of rocking up to try and get World Cup points, and so I had almost made my mind up. So for me, I would say that the letter actually, I thought, helped the cause to try and convince the players that this wasn't the right thing to do.
My understanding of the timeline of version of events, correct me if I'm wrong here, is that letter was the tipping point in that all the way through you'd been told by the administrators it's got to be safety and security. That's the only reason you can't go to Zimbabwe is on those grounds. And after it came and it was decided that England weren't going to go, that was the public message really that was coming from maybe the ECB. You wrote soon after that you had a little bit of regret actually that was the line, because there was the moral issue that maybe that wasn't communicated.
I didn't want to go, but I'm England captain and we need to get points to qualify for the next stage of the World Cup. So I'm trying to convince the ICC and the ECB, if there is something in the playing conditions and rules, the only way the game can be called off is for security and safety, and we're getting letters from someone about death threats to us and our family. That strikes me as safety and security. So if we can use that to not go, fine. But again, I repeat, if you give me the choice of now looking back, what would I have liked to have done would have said, I am not going to Zimbabwe for these reasons, for moral reasons. I hugely admire what Alonga and Flower are doing. I wish we were brave enough to do that. I don't think it's our place to go to Zimbabwe as England cricketers and wear black armbands, but I hugely admire these two people. So I'll be perfectly honest, I was trying to hide behind that letter to get the game called off on security grounds, but also it meant that we wouldn't be taking a team to Zimbabwe, and that was the fundamental thing, that was the core thing that I was trying to achieve. I didn't personally want to take captain aside in Zimbabwe at that time.
At the time you were pretty strong about the way the administrators conducted themselves and the way the government left cricketers to make a decision. Still feel that way?
When you get the job of England captain, I'd travelled with Graham Gooch and I'd seen Michael Atherton, and so I knew when you get that job, when you get the phone call from David Graveney, your job as England captain is not just about win the toss and bat or bowl and mess that up or whatever, or work out your side or have a third man or an extra slip. You are an ambassador for your country. So, you are there to make bigger decisions than just the game of cricket. You are there to represent your country, and this is my point about why I didn't want to go to Zimbabwe. I didn't want to represent our country at that time in Zimbabwe. for the people of Zimbabwe more than anything else. So I wanted to make that point. So it wasn't like I shouldn't be. Some people say, "Oh, you shouldn't be making those decisions, Nasser. You should be concentrating on the Greek." No, you're captain of England. You have to at times discuss things with the ICC, with the ECB, and at times with the government. It was just the sort of the level of silence from the ECB and the government, the manoeuvring, and from the ICC in particular, Malcolm Speed in particular, was a level of disbelief that we were even thinking. It was just like a non-subject for them. It was just like a closed door. You are going, and the only reason you can't go is safety and security. And there was no discussion. It was just like, we are not talking about this. This is the way it is. So it was almost like a playing condition or a law in the game of cricket. And I thought that there should have been more discussions, a little bit of more help from the ICC back then, and possibly from our government and ECB as well.
Do you think the sons and daughters letter was valid? Some people think it was a hoax.
Some people do. I think Duncan thought that as well at the time. But you never know. When you've got young people in the room and you try and tell some of those people as captain, don't worry, it's a hoax. Probably 999 times out of 100 you're right. That one time you say, it's a hoax, and you didn't quite get it right. It's not like, shall I bowl Jimmy the extra over like I did in Port Elizabeth, and you get that wrong. You lose a World Cup game. With something like that, when there's death threats to team and family, it's not something you just say, this could be a hoax. You have to take it seriously, is my point. It's not like, maybe. You have to take this seriously. And I knew some of the team, when they saw the letter, they then realised, OK, we are taking this seriously. We are not going. Now, I guess by our actions, if we just went and played, like your very first question, can you believe you didn't play? If we didn't make anything, if I hadn't had the conversation with Michael Atherton on the outfield or watched the Channel 4 documentary on it and seen what was going on in Zimbabwe, and we hadn't made any kind of fuss, I don't think that letter would have emerged. It was the fact that we were making a fuss and it became an issue, and then the letter emerged, that it sort of snowballed even more.
You resigned as one-day captain. You resigned as test captain later that year. Was what happened in the World Cup, was that a contributing factor to you going as test captain? Were you running out of steam?
I was running out of steam, but more for cricketing reasons. I wasn't the greatest ever white ball player. I was a pretty good white ball captain. I enjoyed captaining in white ball cricket. I loved it, in fact. But I wasn't a great white ball player. And the era of you can just stay in the side because you're a decent captain, that was the Mike Brearley era, was soon, rapidly in the rear view mirror. So I was gone, and that added to that. I said after I retired and the captaincy and nearly in tears or in tears was the emotions. You just don't want to, you just can't do it anymore. You run out of steam. You can't keep going to the well anymore. The well is empty. And obviously that period added to that. But I repeat that, if you're asking me that about that World Cup, it was more Port Elizabeth. It was...
Because you could have got through, couldn't you?
Yeah, we could have. And then what added to that? So we lose those points, which we no guarantee of getting, as I say. We go in Port Elizabeth and we are bossing a game and winning it against the mighty Australia, and Bickle and Bevan play that innings. And then even then, we go back to, and we were in PE at the hotel, Holiday Inn, and, Zimbabwe are playing someone...
Pakistan, I think, was washed out.
And like a hurricane or something, some tropical storm just appeared from nowhere in Zimbabwe and just washed out the game. That was the last thing we needed, because if that's washed out, we're now out. And that side were a pretty good side, and that's what wrangles with, Nighty and a few others. So that was a pretty good side that could have gone a bit further in that World Cup. We've only got ourselves to blame. We should have beaten Australia. We left it when it got out of our hands, and then the weather came in, and we were done. I was done.
Just to sort of, conclude, really, it's 20 years on, reading what you wrote at that time, it was so raw to you. What about now? How does it feel to think back to it? Time
heals, and you often think, again, going back to your first question as to, can we really believe a game was called off by a group of players that just refused to go? You often think, should we have gone? Should we have just, like Murali said to me in disbelief at breakfast, why aren't you going to Zimbabwe? Why wouldn't you go to Zimbabwe? I do think it is and you can, as I've said to you can go round in a circle, and you've got to be very careful when you start picking and choosing your morals and who you stand up to and who you don't. You can get yourself on some very thin ice. But looking back on it, am I proud that I didn't go to Zimbabwe as England captain at that stage? Yes. Would I have been even more proud if I'd done it the right way, like Flower and Alonga, and said we are not going because of the moral issues of what's going on? Definitely. Did we fudge it? Yes. But at that stage, the place that I was in, and it may have, little knowledge is dangerous. Some people might argue that what was going on in Zimbabwe, who are we, or who am I, who are English and England to tell Zimbabwe how to run their country? Some people might be saying, stay out of their politics, mate. What do you know about it? So it is a very complicated issue, and because it was complicated, I'm quite pleased that I wasn't the England captain that took a World Cup side to Zimbabwe at that time. I would have done it differently, yes, and it's great to see them back playing, and we've got a game coming up against them, and I'm sure it'll become a talking point and we'll discuss it, and hopefully Zimbabwe have moved on. I've moved on, but it was a traumatic time at the time.
One final thought. Spoke to Henry Alonga last week. He explained how by getting through to the Super Sixes, Zimbabwe got out of Zimbabwe to play those games in South Africa, and therefore him and Andy Flower were out of the country and never went back.
Yeah.
He said you guys are heroes and he owes you a beer.
I'll take him up on that.